All right, guys, we're going to go ahead, excuse me, and finish up the second part of our Cold War lesson. Basically, you got to remember that starting in 1945 after World War II, you have two main superpowers. You have the Soviet Union, also called the USSR, and you have the United States, who both come up into a very, very powerful situation because of them both having political strength and having a lot of military power that would influence a lot of the countries that are around them. Okay. Now, so what's going on as far as um, the difference? Remember that the Soviet Union, they were communist. They believed in a very strong very strong central government that controlled everything, which also included the economy. Whereas the U.S. believed that it was a democracy, which meant it was a government by the people, and that the economy should be run through your private citizens, which is called capitalism. Okay. So here we are, we're right in the middle of this Cold War. And so, what else does this mean? Basically, guys, a Cold War means that there is no direct conflict. Okay, there's no fighting, there's no gunshots. Basically, this is a war of words and a war of fear from 1945 until 1991. Okay, basically, guys, these two countries are trying to build themselves up to be the most powerful country to keep from the other side taking over. Okay, one of the biggest things that they started spending money on was what was called the arms race. Basically, they both were trying to bring in stockpiles of weapons. They wanted nuclear bombs. They wanted the best planes and tanks and all of that sort of things. And they wanted to build this up just in case another war broke out. Okay. So a lot of money started being directed towards military buildup. Um, Another aspect of the Cold War was called the space race. If you could show that you could make it to space or you could be the first one to do things in space, it would also show that you not only had the most technology, but you must have had a lot of money because you were able to spend it on these things. Okay. So the Soviet Union and the United States were trying to have the most advanced science and technology. More so than the other. So basically, guys, they kept trying to be the very first one to put a man in space. Now, the Soviet Union did edge us out on actually getting someone into space, but the United States actually won the space race by putting a man on the moon. Now, think about how much money is being spent not only on weapons, but now on this space race. And just keep that in mind as we go along. Basically, guys, neither side trusts the other. They all think that the other side is trying to rule the world. And so basically, neither side is truly giving up any leeway, which means that their people live in fear. They don't want another world war to erupt. Watching the consequences of the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima to end World War II in Japan really has a lot of people on edge. They don't want to be wiped out like that. Okay. So, how are they going to stop the communism? Well, here's the deal. Once World War II stopped, basically the USSR and the USA start trying to bring in lots of alliances in order to protect themselves if another world war happened. Okay. So in 1949, they bring in what was called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Basically, guys, this is going to be the formal alliance of Western European countries, Canada, and the U.S. And basically, they came together because they felt like if they could get their numbers together, then the Soviet Union would not want to attack such a large entity. Okay, there's your countries that were a part of it. Okay. If you can tell, NATO covered a lot of area, especially in comparison to the communist countries along with the USSR. But here was the biggest kicker. Okay. Germany was the country that everybody met in at the end of World War II. Okay. So the Allies decided that let's go ahead, each one of us will take a section of Germany, and that way we can help build it back up. So each section, the Soviet Union, France, Great Britain, and America all had their own section. Well, the Western Allies wanted to eventually unite Germany and turn it into a democracy. But of course, the Soviets did not want to do that. So eventually, the Allied powers turned all of their pieces into what was called West Germany, and the Soviet section became East Germany. Okay. So you literally have a democratic Western Germany and a communistic Eastern Germany. They also took the capital of Berlin, although it was in the Soviet zone, they also split it amongst the democratic allies and the communist Soviet. Okay. Now, what do you think is going to happen? Sorry, guys. What do you think is going to happen to the people who are over here in the Soviet zone? Are they going to have the same treatment as those in the Western zone? Well, basically, guys, they weren't. All right. This was just talking again about the fact that Berlin was split. Okay. Um, you can see exactly how it was split. So here's what starts happening. In 1948, the Soviets start actually blockading all the land and water traffic that was going into Western Berlin. And ultimately, what they were going to do is they were trying to block out the Allies and make them want to leave. But basically, they didn't want to leave. They didn't want to leave these people there by themselves. So, one of the things that they started doing is the United States and Great Britain started doing what was called an airlift. Okay. And what it did is it actually took supplies into Berlin, into the Soviets, the western side of Berlin, and they would drop the supplies that Western Berlin needed. That meant it was food, fuel, raw materials, all the things that these people needed in order to survive. And it lasted over an 11-month period. What does this show? It shows that the United States and the Allies were not backing away from this issue. Okay. You'll have people that remember, kids at this point remember these times, like getting little pieces of candy and things like that from these airlifts. Okay. So this was a big deal to these people that were stuck in East Berlin, or excuse me, in West Berlin. Okay. They looked at the United States as being, and Great Britain as being heroes. So does this keep the Soviet Union in good graces with people from Germany? Absolutely not. And this is going to start causing a whole lot of tension between them as well. Okay. So now what? So 11 months is over. How are they going to take care of these people? Well, basically, Germany officially becomes two countries. You have West Germany with the new capital of Bonn. You have East Germany with the new capital of East Berlin. Okay. Basically, West Berlin is still standing strong. They are not going into the communistic side of Germany. So they're still standing strong. Okay. So what happens after that? Well, basically, while that went on in Germany, you also have communism that is spreading around the world. Okay. In Japanese occupied Korea, you actually, they split it between northern and southern. The Soviet Union controls the northern part of Korea. And so the United States came in and they were in charge of South Korea. Basically, again, you've got a country that is split between communism and democracy. So in 1950, the leader of North Korea basically sends his men into South Korea trying to take it over. But South Korea, along with the help of the United States, basically held tight and kept South Korea from being invaded. Okay. From that, basically, with all the UN forces, which those allied nations come in, and they actually were able to run out the North Korea army from South Korea. So they were actually able to save South Korea from becoming communistic. Okay. There's your two guys dealing with North and South Korea. Basically, guys, once the Korean War ended in 1953, nobody was really victorious. But basically, they said, look, at the 38th degree parallel line, at that point, if you're communist and you're from North Korea, you don't pass that line. If you're from South Korea and you're included in the democracy, you do not cross into that 38th parallel line. And that is still there today, believe it or not. Okay. This is actually a building. If anybody needs to come in to talk, to deal with relations or anything, these are your two buildings. Okay. You've got your North Korea side and your South Korea side, and that's how they handle their business. Okay. So basically, guys, South Korea does remain free. Korea was very badly damaged. There were a lot of lives lost, but they still are two separate countries still today. The reunification talks have started, but they're not going very fast at all. Okay. McCarthy and Khrushchev, these are two men that actually cause a whole lot of issues during the Cold War time. Basically, Joseph McCarthy, truly, he was a senator, and he basically was in charge of what we ended up calling the witch hunt for communists. People were already scared. Remember, I called it the Red Scare. They were already scared that communism was going to come in and they were going to take over and everybody's freedoms were going to be lost. Well, basically, what he started doing is going on TV. He started getting with actors and writers and all of these people, and he started putting propaganda out there talking about how communism was bad, and if you thought your neighbor, your aunts, your family members, anybody, if you felt like they were communists, you should turn them in. And what that did, guys, is it started ruining people's lives left and right. If you were labeled as a communist, your life was ruined. It didn't matter what you did, money wise, job wise, whatever, you were ruined at that point. And it was simply because Joseph McCarthy wanted to scare everybody into thinking that this, communism was so bad and we didn't want it there. He ruined people's lives left and right. Khrushchev was actually important because he was there for when the Communist Party came together. He was the man who initiated the space program. But his big thing was he had this big idea of placing nuclear missiles in Cuba to basically show the United States that, hey, if you step out of line, we've got missiles aimed at you and we're only 90 miles away. And this is what's going to lead into the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay. Basically, guys, Khrushchev wanted to overtake the United States in productivity, meaning that he wanted to make more stuff, make more money than the United States. But basically, guys, he ended up being overthrown in 1964 and then later died in Moscow. Okay. Now, Cuban Missile Crisis. What was it? Basically, guys, in 1962, the Soviets sent these ballistic missiles. They put them in Cuba and basically said, look, you step out of line, we're going to destroy you. There were enough missiles in Cuba that could destroy the entire southeast part of the United States. Okay. You can kind of see through this map right here, this whole part of the United States would have been wiped off the map if they had hit us with those ballistic missiles. Basically, guys, during this time period, John F. Kennedy, who was the president of the United States, ordered a blockade to Cuba, which basically meant that they were not allowing anybody in or out of Cuba. They also sent troops to Florida just in case. And basically, he told the nation, told the world that, hey, if there's any attack on the U.S. from Cuba, it's going to be an act of war by the Soviet Union, and that would put us back into a war. Okay. He also signs a blockade, which did not allow any goods or services from Cuba into the United States or out of the United States to Cuba. Basically, guys, this leads to 13 tense days. The Soviet leader, Khrushchev, and Cuba, they finally decide that, hey, we're going to go ahead and pull our missiles out. The United States also agreed to never try to invade Cuba, and they actually pulled out their own missiles from Italy and Turkey. Basically, guys, this 13 days showed how close we were to a nuclear war. Okay. The Vietnam War was also another war in Southeast Asia. Basically, again, it's a communist country trying to take over its southern country uh, to the south. Basically, guys, this was just a complete mess. Okay, um, the United States sent troops over here because they thought that, like dominoes, once you knock one domino off, it keeps happening. Basically, they said that we're trying to keep communism out of these countries so it will stop spreading. Okay, which was great. But basically, guys, the Viet Congs, which was the North Vietnam's war style of warfare, was very bad. It left to very unfavorable conditions, fighting conditions, and basically, guys, the Americans were being destroyed left and right. Okay, ultimately, guys, there was a lot of protest in the United States because they did not believe we should have even been in this war. So finally, in 1973, Nixon finally withdrew our troops out of Vietnam. Uh, it was definitely a very bad time period, guys. North Vietnam was able to continue to take control of South Vietnam, which brought it together under communist rule. Now, the U.S. is on friendly terms with the country today, but it is still a communist country. Okay. So, how did Germany, what is German reunification? Basically, guys, you have people in the East hated living under communist conditions. What started happening is you had people starting to leave East Berlin, heading into West Berlin. Okay, and so the East German government wanted this to stop. So in 1961, East Germany builds a 103-mile long wall between East and West Berlin called the Berlin Wall. It was guarded by Soviet troops, and it became a huge symbol that showed the separation between East and Western Europe. Okay, there's the building of the wall. They actually controlled it to where they would not let people from East Berlin into West Berlin. Okay. Um, Now, that was what it looked like in 1989. Okay. Basically, guys, the Soviet regime starts to lose a lot of control over the years because they're spending all of their money on military. They're spending all of their money on a space race. And because they did this, the Soviet Union could not keep up with the cost of the food for its citizens. Okay. Basically, in the 1980s, the Soviet people had started to lose their faith in the communist system and they started to protest. Eventually, when your government starts to weaken, these protests can truly bring about change. Okay. Finally, in 1985, Gorbachev, the head of the USSR, starts to reduce the government control of businesses. And so their citizens start to experience a little bit more freedom. Okay, that was Gorbachev. Basically, guys, in 1989, with the help of several surrounding allied countries, November the 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall is torn down. Okay. Basically, guys, it was made very well aware that the government had lost control. The communist government had lost control. Okay, this right here is a very powerful time showing the wall coming down. Okay. Finally, guys, after 30 years, Germany is reunited. Finally, in 1990, the Germans vote to make both East and West Germany a country again. And at that point marked the moment when Germany becomes a democratic country. Okay. All right, guys. So basically, guys, between 89 and 91, that's the collapse of the Soviet Union. Once the Soviet Union is collapsed, all the countries that came together to build the Soviet Union become 15 independent countries again. And Russia becomes Russia in the end. All right. Good stuff.